Greetings to you all in the most precious name of our soon coming Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Welcome to yet another episode of our study of the Gospel of Mark. Continue to subscribe to my channel and get updates for the videos that I am uploading on my channel. And let's move on with the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 12 and 13. We read in this passage that the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Why did he do that? It was all a part to fulfill God's righteousness. Jesus will come face to face with the devil who was responsible for sin entering the human world. And Jesus will identify himself in temptation with us as he identified himself with us in our birth, in growth, in baptism. To fulfill all righteousness would mean to obey God at all times and to be victorious over sin and Satan. So the Spirit sends Jesus into an arid place with no food for 40 days and 40 nights. We read in Mark's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 12, that 12 and 13, that Jesus was in the wilderness with wild animals. Before I move ahead, I'll tell two things. I'll add on Matthew 4 verse 1 to 11 and Luke 4 verse 1 to 13 in our study for this video. So what is the significance of the wilderness and the wild animals? The wilderness is considered to be the domain of the devil. In Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God created the world with lush vegetation and abundance. But with the sin of man coming into the world, the ground is cursed, and wilderness is an after effect of God's curse in the world. So I'll just mention a few verses in the Gospels and in the Old Testament. Matthew 12:43, Luke 8:29, Isaiah 13 verse 20 to 22, Isaiah 34 verse 8 to 15. Dry, uninhabited places where animals only lived were considered as places of God's curse, and this is where demons resided. This is how people thought of in those days. And what is the significance with Jesus being driven into the wilderness by the Spirit? The Spirit drove Jesus into the turf or the home turf of the devil so that Jesus would face off with the devil in the devil's home ground and defeat the devil. This is what we need to understand with Jesus being sent into the wilderness. So Jesus will stand in our place and gain victory over Satan's temptations in the areas where we all failed. If we are looking at Matthew and Luke, we read that Jesus was there in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. In the Old Testament, we have a parallel to this. Israel journeyed through the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus, over here, was in the wilderness for 40 days. So the wilderness part and the number 40 are the similarities in this passage. So let's look at these three specific temptations that Jesus faced from Satan, and we will look at the response that Jesus made for each temptation that he faced. So the first temptation in here is Satan says, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread." Well, why the if clause in here? Why did Satan say, if you are the Son of God? I'm giving some questions that we need to ask to this text. Why the specific command of Satan to change the stones into bread? Why the if clause here? Okay. Why the specific command of Satan to turn the stones into bread? During the temptation that lasted 40 days, Jesus was hungry. He was fasting during that time. And Satan capitalizes on this hunger of Jesus and gives a suggestion to Jesus with a conditional clause. So Satan attacks an immediate need of Jesus and gives a conditional clause, if you are the Son of God. So let's look at some things that Satan does here. Number one, Satan is trying to create a doubt on Jesus' sonship in Jesus' mind. Why is it? Because right before this passage, we see that when Jesus was baptized, the Spirit came upon him, and the Father said from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." So the Father had given such a testimony about Jesus. And now Satan is trying to create a doubt in Jesus' mind regarding his sonship to the Father. So that is one thing that Satan does here. Satan creates a doubt in Jesus' mind, or tries to create a doubt in Jesus' mind regarding Jesus' sonship to the Father. The second thing he does here is he is trying to get Jesus use his divine abilities at Satan's command to make the temptation easier. Satan is trying to get Jesus use his divine abilities to make the temptation easier at his command, at Satan's command. Okay. Third, Satan is attacking the immediate need of Christ. So he's trying to create a doubt in Jesus' mind. He's trying to get Jesus use his abilities to make the temptation easier at his command, and Satan attacks the immediate need of Christ. Satan attacks that immediate need of Christ, just like he would do with all of us. Do we know that most of the robbers, thieves, murderers, or whatever illegal activities are happening, they are all happening because people needed money or something that they needed really urgent. So that temptation is now there in Jesus' life. So he is hungry, and Satan wants him to do something morally wrong, or get Jesus. He's trying to get Jesus to listen to him. And in hunger or in desperate needs, man will do whatever it takes to satisfy that, because all that man wants is his hunger is to be satisfied. Yet, how does Jesus respond to this spiritual battle as a warrior? He responds to that by quoting Deuteronomy 8, verse 3. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. The context of Deuteronomy 8:23 is that God allowed the people of Israel to go hungry in the wilderness, and then he fed them with manna. Why? He was letting them know of this truth, that they don't live by physical bread only. They live by what comes from God's mouth. God let them go through the 40 years in the wilderness to hunger experiences, through hunger experiences, to test what is in their heart and whether they would obey God in the midst of hunger. And they failed. Multiple times they rebelled against God, they grumbled against God. Jesus, unlike Israel, doesn't grumble against God for this hunger. Jesus doesn't disobey God. He doesn't grumble against God. Rather, he gives weightage to God's words at that time. He puts it above his physical hunger. He doesn't use his divine abilities or prerogatives selfishly, but he lives on complete dependence on God for all things. So where Israel failed in the wilderness, Jesus wins the battle. Now the other thing we need to know here is Satan is trying to get Christ use his divine prerogative to make the trial easier. And Satan is trying to bring down the love of God in Jesus' mind. But Jesus, in replying like this, he says that Jesus will obey God even if it costs his life. So when Satan is trying to make Jesus use his divine abilities to make the trial easier, as he is hungry right now, Jesus says to Satan, even if it costs my life, I will obey him. His words are much more than my hunger. And this is not just an occurrence here. In John chapter 4, Jesus says about the mission that he came to fulfill. My food and drink is to do the will of him who sent me. So even there, Jesus has put God's words and God's mission ahead of his physical needs. So what Jesus is saying right now is not a one-off occurrence. It was a lifestyle that Jesus had. Now, the other thing that we need to know in this passage is that Satan tries to get Jesus do something which aborts his mission. I'll tell you how it is. Jesus came to identify with us. Let's not forget that. So Satan tries to get Jesus to convert stones into bread. Let's notice all of the miracles that Jesus did. All the miracles that Jesus did are done in one way or the other in the Old Testament. Does Jesus have the ability to change stones into bread? Obviously, he has the ability to do that. But Jesus wouldn't do any miracle that violates the purpose of his coming. The purpose of his coming is to be our representative. And he will not do anything that violates that. So, he will not do any miracles that violate that purpose of being our representative. As I said, in the Old Testament, there are so many miracles, and Jesus' miracles are a repetition of those miracles. Let me explain. Jesus raised the dead. Lazarus, the daughter of Jairus, and the son of the widow at Nain. In the Old Testament, Elijah and Elisha, they raised people from the dead. Jesus healed lepers. Naaman was healed by Elisha. Naaman, being a leper, was healed by Elisha. Jesus drove away evil spirits. David drove away the evil spirit that was there in Saul. Jesus fed 5,000 in the wilderness. Again, that's a wilderness experience. And in the book of Kings, I'll write the reference in the video. In the book of Kings, Jesus will, in the book of Kings, Elisha's ministry sees an event where 100 people are fed with limited amount of food, which is again a reminder of what Jesus did at the feeding of the 5,000. So all of Jesus' miracles are a repetition or an extension of what was already happening in the Old Testament. So Jesus didn't do anything different. Okay, so he is identifying with all of the men who did miracles in the Old Testament times. He will not do anything which is going to have his mission of identifying with us abolished. Okay, so these are the three to four things that we need to understand in the first temptation. So now let's look at the second temptation. Satan tells to Jesus, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from the temple. So again, Satan tries to create a doubt in Jesus' mind. And in this temptation, Satan adds a catchy bait or a trap here. In the first temptation, Jesus answered with the scriptures. And in the second temptation, Satan puts the scriptures as a trap to get Jesus to sin. He adds Psalm 91 verse 11 and 12 in this portion. The location, as we know, of the second temptation is the pinnacle of the temple. Since Jesus quoted scriptures to Satan, Satan tries a different approach. He adds a verse into his temptation and wrongly applies that verse to get Jesus to do something he wants. So what does Satan want Jesus to do? The pinnacle of the temple, let's get this straight. The pinnacle of the temple was 300 feet above the floor of the Kidron Valley. So this was a high point. Satan wants Jesus to jump off the pinnacle of the temple. And Satan reminds Jesus that there was a promise in the Old Testament regarding God's protection to those who trusted in him. God will send his angels to guard Jesus, lest Jesus be injured. Okay, it's true that God will send his angels, but it's not now. After this specific temptation is over, after this whole 40 days temptation is done, God will send his angels to minister to Jesus. And he does send his angels to minister. Mark 1 verse 13. So, um, God will send his angels again in the Garden of Gethsemane to again sustain Jesus over there. So, God will not send his angels right now. So, Satan wants Jesus to doubt if God's promise of protection is valid. This inclusion of Psalm 91 verse 11 and 12 makes it so attractive here. So, how did Jesus answer this? Jesus answered it like this by quoting Deuteronomy 6 verse 16. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Deuteronomy 6:16 is an allusion or a reference to the event that happened in Massa, Exodus 17 verse 1 to 7. The people were thirsty for water, and in that process they doubt if God cares for them. Is the Lord among us or not? That's what they were asking. They wanted a proof of God being with him, and they were trying to see God if God was there. So God had already proved his love to them and his existence to them by the plagues, by bringing them out of the land of Egypt, by the parting of the Red Sea. Yet they were trying to constantly show unbelief by testing the Lord. A similar situation like that is created here, where Satan is trying to create doubts in the mind of Jesus and create doubts regarding Jesus' sonship to God. So Satan tries to get Jesus doubt God's goodness, but Jesus is victorious over Satan where Israel failed in the wilderness. One more thing we need to understand here is there was a common Jewish expectation at that time that the Messiah will appear on the top of the temple. And if Jesus survived the fall, then he would have a huge fan following. A huge fan following, which in turn will prevent the redemptive work for which he came into this world in the first place. So, this is why Jesus is so mindful of the mission that he has. So, each temptation, let me just remind this to you, each temptation here is an attempt by Satan to abolish the work that Jesus came to do for us. The first temptation was to avoid Jesus being identified with us. The second temptation was to prevent the death of Jesus from happening by getting him a huge fan following. So that is what Jesus withstood by quoting Deuteronomy 6 verse 16. Now we will move to the third temptation in a few moments from now. Satan took Jesus to a high mountain and then said, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world and its glory if you will fall down and worship me. So the challenge here is if Jesus worships Satan, if Jesus falls before Satan and worships him, Satan will give him everything, all the kingdoms of the world and all its glory. Well, why is such a temptation there? Satan is not the real owner of the universe. We know that Satan is a liar, and Satan is not the real owner of the universe. So why is he saying that he is in authority to give the authority of the world to Jesus? It's true that he influences the world heavily. In this temptation, he offers authority to all kingdoms in exchange for Jesus' worship. Over here, Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 6 verse 13, where the warning is given to the Israelites when they will be prone to apostasy and forgetting the Lord. When they are prone to apostasy and forgetting the Lord, God will not tolerate the spiritual adultery of his people for any reason. And Jesus says, Be gone, Satan. You shall worship the Lord your God, and only him shall you serve. So Jesus is victorious in that regard. However, there is a deeper level of temptation that Satan is trying to get Jesus uh, fall into. Well, what exactly is a temptation? We will look at that in our next video. Until then, may God bless all of you and have uh, a mind to study God's scriptures and be like Jesus.